This episode of the Internet History Podcast is brought to you by Audible. With more than 150,000 titles to choose from, Audible is the leading provider of audiobooks and spoken word entertainment on the web. For a free audiobook, as well as a free 30-day trial, please visit audibletrial.com/internet history. That's audibletrial.com/internet history. Welcome again to the Internet History Podcast. I'm your host, Brian McCullough. This is Chapter 2, Supplemental Episode 3. Yes, if you're confused, we're going just a bit back in time, at least in terms of the chronology of our project here. But I was absolutely thrilled that Ben Slivka agreed to come on the podcast with us, because obviously at this point we've got plenty of oral histories relating to Netscape and the development of their web browser, but so far we've only spoken to a handful of people about Internet Explorer. And obviously Internet Explorer was every bit as vital to the development of the early web as Netscape and Navigator were, so I've been eager to get more background from the Microsoft side of the story. And who better than Ben Slivka, who was one of the godfathers of the Internet Explorer project at Microsoft. Ben was actually kind enough to come to my home to speak with me, and it's a bit of a funny story. In my research, I kept hearing how Ben was notorious for wearing Hawaiian shirts and shorts in almost any weather, so sure enough, on Halloween Day, it was about 55 degrees here in Brooklyn, and so I go out on my stoop to try to keep a lookout for Ben to see when he shows up, and sure enough, here comes Ben, walking down the sidewalk in a bright Hawaiian shirt and shorts. So I knew who I was looking for. Ben is such a great, fun guy, and he was generous and kind enough to give me several hours of his time, recounting where Microsoft was as a company before Windows 95 and the web. And he brought along copious notes, so he was able to walk me and all of us through the entire development cycle of Internet Explorer from versions 1.0 through 4.0 and beyond. So if you're interested at all in the technological and feature development of the modern web browser, then you're unlikely to hear a better hour of conversation. I'm sure you're going to enjoy it, so without further ado, let's get to the conversation with Ben Slivka. Ben Slivka, thanks for coming on the Internet History Podcast.
Brian, happy to be here.
So I always like to start off with a little bit of the schooling. I know that you're a big Northwestern guy.
Go Cats!
You got your computer science degree at Northwestern early 80s, right?
Correct, yeah. So I grew up in Seattle. My first airplane flight was off to Chicago for Northwestern in 1978. I did computer science and applied math undergrad, met and married my wife my senior year of college, spent a year at IBM in Poughkeepsie, New York, back when it had 364,000 employees and was the computer company in the world. Came back, got a master's in computer science, and based on my IBM experience, decided that mainframes were dead, mini computers would be next, and so Lisa and I went off to Microsoft in 1985.
The story that I've read about getting recruited or getting a job at Microsoft was that you sent a letter to any sir or madam at Microsoft looking for a job. Is that true?
Yes. Well, back in 1985, we didn't have email, really. There were some very modest email services. So I sent snail mail letters to Apple and to Microsoft. Never heard back from Apple. Heard back from Microsoft. They wanted code samples, so I sent them some projects and flew out and interviewed on February 1st of 1985. And got a job offer at the end of my day of interviews.
And who did you interview with? Do you remember?
A bunch of different people. The last person I interviewed was with Gordon Letwin, and he was employee number 8. If you look at that iconic photo those original Microsoft employees. He's the very dark-haired, shaggy, bearded guy with the sunglasses.
So, what are you hired on for? You're just general software, or did you have a expertise or anything like that?
Well, I ended up starting in the operating system group, and so I had a lot of experience with computers going back to when I was 16, and so I took a Fortran 4 programming class in high school. This was with an IBM 029 card punch that the chair of the math department had in his room. And so back then you would punch up your Fortran program, one line of code per card, and then you'd put your name and a rubber band around it. It would be shuttled down to the mainframe computer at the school district headquarters, and you waited 2 or 3 days for it to get runs at some slack time overnight and then sent back to you. So that was my kind of first real exposure to programming. Being sort of impatient even then, I got an account at the University of Washington in Seattle. It's at its academic computing center, and where I paid real dollars and did programming on my own behalf. And I actually put up a card. I got people to pay me money to do computer consulting for them, and that led me to Northwestern. Actually, there were some programs there that were copyright Northwestern. At Northwestern, there was we had a Control Data Corporation mainframe, and it was the same manufacturer as the University of Washington had. That was a more unusual, high-end scientific computer. It had 60-bit words, which people out there will think is pretty odd since it's not a power of 2. And the summer before my senior year, there was a class on the operating system that ran this computer, and the local software engineers employed by the Academic Computing Center at Northwestern had made so many changes to the standard CDC operating system that when a big new operating system release came out, it was going to take too long for them to integrate that. So they kept their version going, and they would steal source code from the newer version. Mm-hmm. And so that was my first sort of experience. And so I spent, I think it was 10 weeks, 3 hours a day, 5 days a week, learning the internals of this operating system. And so I actually got to hack on the operating system, make some changes. There was all this dead start time. And so when I got to IBM, the first thing I did, they wanted me to take a programming class. And I was like, I think I can learn that myself. We finally agreed that I take their MVS system programmer training course. And that was an 8-week course on the internals of their fancy MVS operating system. And so I'd taken operating system classes both as an undergrad and a grad student. So I kind of wanted to work on operating systems or user interface or programming languages, and I ended up getting hired into what became the OS2 team at Microsoft.
So you started on the OS2 team, not on DOS?
Correct. It was called MT-DOS, multitasking DOS, mm-hmm. But that was the original goal. There was to run multiple DOS applications to multitask them in 640K of memory on an 8086, which proved to be a little challenging.
So the OS2 project is a little star-crossed. Did you work on that all the way through its sort of denouement, as it were?
Yes. So it was sort of just getting started when I started in June of 1985, and I was on that for 5.5 years until we divorced IBM. So we signed what we called a joint development agreement with IBM in the fall of 1985, and there was a division of labor, and they worked on some bits and we worked on some bits. And I like to describe that as a cross-country car ride where let's say you and I get in the car and we're driving from LA to the East Coast, and it works fine for the first few thousand miles, but as we get closer to the finish line, it turns out I'm actually trying to go to New York City and you're trying to go to Miami. And so Microsoft wanted to build really what Windows became. And IBM just wanted to build an operating system that was an appendage to their mainframe operating systems that would make PCs be better mainframe clients.
And culture clash as well between the Microsoft people and IBM people?
Vastly. So as I said, Microsoft. Well, when I started at IBM back in '82, when I was an employee for IBM. It was 364,000 people. When I joined Microsoft in June of '85, it was not quite 800 people. And IBM had been around for 60, 80 years, and Microsoft was about 10 years old.
You also worked on the first production LAN, is that correct?
Yeah, well, so we were working on OS2, and so back then, today we're spoiled with 50 or 100 megabit a second download speeds, with Wi-Fi even. So back when I was using computers in the 1970s, if you wanted to connect to a computer remotely, you used a modem, which would connect at either 100 baud or 300 baud, which is to say 10 characters per second or 10 bytes per second or 30 bytes per second. Now, computers had, in the mid-'80s, they had serial ports, and you could establish a serial port connection between two computers with a hard wire, so you wouldn't do this over long distances. And the maximum speed was 19.2, so 19.2 K baud, 19.2 thousand bits per second, or about 1900 bytes per second. So the way we did source code control, so a bunch of us are working together to build OS2. We're checking out files, editing them, checking them back in. That source code control is done on a mainframe computer, a DEC mainframe. And the way we got our files between our PCs, where we're using editing and building tools, and to do source control on the mainframe was to use the FTP program, file transfer protocol, an old Unix utility, to transfer the files up to the mainframe and back down. And so that 19.2 is not too fast. And so I thought that if we had a local file server with all the files, people could just copy them over in the morning to get the latest files. And so there was a group next door that was building MSNet, Microsoft Network. And so I got some building utility guys to help me wire up some coaxial cables and put jacks in the walls, and I got network cards for everyone. And so 15 or 20 of us working on OS2, I got two IBM ATs, which were 80286 Intel chips, a megabyte or two of RAM, 8 megahertz clock speeds, and they had whopping 20 megabyte hard drives. And I called one of them Hagar for the cartoon character, and the other one was called Opus. I don't remember why we needed two. And that was the first, as far as I know, that was the first production LAN where we were doing source control that way.
So is that sort of what maybe sparks you down the road of networking and those sorts of technologies? Or
I don't think so. I mean, I think the when we talk about Internet Explorer, my interest there was more as an application platform and a delivery platform, not networking particularly.
Let me take a different angle at it. Do you remember the first time encountering the web? Not the internet, but the web itself.
Yeah, so it was June of 1994, and I was in a friend's office, and he was surfing the web with this Mosaic web browser, which had been built coincidentally at University of Illinois, and it was a Windows graphical web browser. So that was the first time I saw the web.
At this point, obviously, Microsoft is ramping up to put out Windows 95. All the development work is going on Windows 95. What is your job? What are you working on for the Windows 95 effort?
Great. So I'd done the OS2 work. I did some early work for what became Windows 95, but it was too early. Then I really was kind of desperate to just ship something that customers would use. And so I worked on MS-DOS 6 and 6.2. That was really satisfying. It was a very small team, and we added some great features, and customers loved that. And then I did a brief setup data compression project. If you've seen .cab files, cabinet files, that was my idea, and I got to write some code for that. Then during that summer of 1994, Brad Silverberg, who was running the DOS and Windows team, had asked a small group of us to start thinking about what to do after Windows 95. And we didn't exactly know when Windows 95 was going to ship. That's the name we finally called it. It was codenamed Chicago at that point. So I was looking at a bunch of things, and I was looking at computer use in the home. So I saw the web, and so back then if you had a dial-up connection, you might have had a 9600 baud modem. And but at Microsoft, you could ask the IT group to put another jack in your wall and connect you up to the open internet at a 1 megabit a second speed. So I actually had what today sounds like a sluggish speed, but compared to the speeds at the time, I had a very high bandwidth internet connection that was always connected. I didn't have to wait for modem dialing.
And so you start to formulate the idea that maybe as a part of this next project, this whatever comes after Windows 95, that there needs to be a browser component to it. Is that what the thinking is?
Yeah. So I saw the internet, and I started to realize, even with all the very rudimentary applications that were available, that HTML and HTTP and web browsers and web servers, that was going to be a powerful platform. So I actually started. So one thing I actually explored as a project was to what I called at the time content index the internet. So there was a sort of an advanced team that had this content indexing demo where they had the entire NT source code base, which was pretty large. And the state of the art at the time was you would have a command line tool, and you wanted to find all references to some procedure name or some variable, and you would run this grep or fgrep tool, and it would as you waited, open every file, search through the file, and try to find hits. And so it was very sluggish. And so their demo was that they created an index beforehand, and so that you could search for something and they'd immediately give you results. Today we go, oh, that sounds like Google or Bing or anything else, but this was 20 years ago. So so one idea I had as a project was to go content index the whole internet, right, which wasn't very large at that time.
Right, it would be doable.
Oh, very doable.
Extremely doable, yeah.
And anyway, and so then I went looking to understand what this content index technology was, and it was it turned out that the whole architecture was the data, the indices, and the query response all happened on one machine. And so the idea of using that technology as structured to index the internet with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of machines. So I kind of gave that project up and decided to go to agitate to go build a web browser.
Do you know whatever became of that project?
Well, nothing ever happened. It was my exploration, and we can talk about another thing I tried to do a year later.
Okay. So you start to agitate for a browser component. Is your idea that it be part of of Windows itself, or a separate client that's a Microsoft client but not as a part of Windows?
Well, I'm working in the Windows 95 team.
Right.
So my idea was this is a part of Windows. And if you look at the state of the operating system marketplace in late 1994, IBM actually ended up shipping. So we divorced IBM in 1990. And so they continued on with the development of this OS2 2.0, which was to run on 32-bit Intel processors. So they actually announced and then shipped OS2 2.0, they called it OS2 Warp 3.0, trying to trade on the Star Trek branding. And it included a web browser, a dial-up internet access kit, a TCP/IP stack, and all the other goodies you need to access the internet. And Apple, which was our other largest competitor back then with their Mac OS, had announced but not shipped that their next Mac OS would include a web browser and internet connectivity. So in the fall of 1994, Microsoft was behind its two largest operating system competitors. In fact, IBM crowed a lot about that in their advertisements.
Because at this point, DOS does not have any internet protocols.
MS-DOS does not, and the current version of Windows at the time was Windows 3.1, which had shipped in 1992.
Right.
And then there's a next version of Windows called Windows for Workgroups.
Wasn't there?
Which shipped in 1993, if I remember correctly.
Because one of those, there was some sort of add-on that added internet protocols at some point, right?
Well, there were a lot of third-party products, and so one of the challenges is, so back, again, if we cast our mind back to the 1994, so there were a bunch of different companies who had built internet access packages. And so to connect to the internet, you had to have some kind of dialing software. You had to have a TCP/IP stack. That's the Transmission Control Protocol / Internet Protocol. You also had to have a sockets API, and that was a layer above TCP/IP that made it easy for C kind of programs to connect to internet servers. And then you often would have an FTP client. Maybe you'd have a web client. You might have a Gopher client. You might have an IRC client. There are a variety of these other internet applications.
There was that one company that sold internet in a box.
Correct.
Right.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that might have been Spry.
Spry, correct.
Right. Yeah. Which was coincidentally in Seattle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is that initially the agitation has to be integrating these protocols now into Chicago. Is that the initial?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Because from an ease of use point of view, and because our two largest competitors in the operating space had already shipped with or announced that they were having integrated internet access. Mm-hmm. So where in the summer of '94, I don't know that it was obvious that we needed a web browser and internet access. By October of '94, it was very apparent to me and several other people that we needed to rush and get that done for Windows 95.
Right, and that becomes, almost a company-wide change. The famous Internet tidal wave memo and things like this.
Well, I don't think company-wide is a very fair statement. I think there were a set of people in the Windows team, Windows 95 team that wanted to do this. There were other groups at Microsoft who had other ideas, and probably a topic we'll come back to. There was this tension between sort of Windows and Office and existing Microsoft products and technologies, and the threat that the internet posed to Windows and Office.
But isn't that somewhat of what was responsible for the delays to Windows 95 eventually launching? Is that at some point the decision is made, all right, we can't launch our big flagship next generation OS without fully integrating internet stuff. Is that?
That's false.
Okay.
So yeah. So there's a lot of stuff you read in the press, and there were lawsuits later. Of course, the Department of Justice sued Microsoft for antitrust violations. So when you're building a complicated piece of software like Windows 95, it ends up there's a sort of a natural cycle to things, and you've got all these features you want, and then you're writing them and you're testing them with users and you're debugging, and there's sort of a natural cycle of these things. So in the summer of 1994, there was some hope that Windows 95 would Chicago, let's call it Chicago, would ship before the end of 1994. Well, that didn't happen. And so I was asked to take over leadership of the Internet Explorer, what became the Internet Explorer project. There had been somebody working on it sort of part-time, but really not making progress. So I got started on that in earnest in very early October of 1994. And so the first thing was like, what should it be and when can we get it done? And there's this idea, I don't know if you've heard the term schedule chicken before, where, so chicken is like, two cars driving each other, who turns off first. That's pretty gory. In schedule chicken, it's this sort of, who's going to get done or who's going to be responsible for delaying. And so I think the Windows 95 project was moving along at kind of its natural rate. And I was trying as hard as I could with my team to get Internet Explorer done in time so we could ship simultaneously with Windows 95. So we licensed this source code from Spyglass, which had in turn licensed it from the Mosaic project at the University of Illinois that I mentioned earlier. And so I quickly grabbed 7 people, and so we licensed the code. We licensed code in late '94. I remember it was December 18th. We get the source code from Spyglass. So I give the team 2 weeks to study the code, and maybe take a little time off for the holidays. And we met back on something like January 4th of 1995, and I wrote a chart on the whiteboard, and I wrote every developer's name as a column, and I wrote 8 weeks down as the rows. So I had this 4x8 matrix, And then I said, who has the most important thing that we have to get done before we ship? And I don't remember what it was, but I wrote that thing in that box. And so we filled out the box. And so we had an 8-week plan. So that's all of January and all of February. And so we did all those things. It turns out we got a few more things done besides that. And so it's February or March, and we're going to have this professional developers conference. And we're going to show off. This is 1995. Well, I'm ahead of you. Okay, so it's 1995. Mm-hmm. So we're trying to figure out when we're going to have a first beta test release and when can we get done. So at the same time, so now sort of the ship schedule for Windows 95 is settling in. We're sort of getting this sense it's going to be done kind of midsummer. And so then the question is, will Internet Explorer be done in time to be in the retail upgrade box? So there were three different shipping criteria or shipping vehicles. So we had to get a binary release of Windows 95 that we could send to our OEM customers: Compaq, IBM, HP, Gateway, all the rest. And they needed that so they could test that, make sure their device drivers worked, and then they could pre-install it in their computers and ship. Okay, so that was one deliverable. A second deliverable was a nice shiny box that we could send out to retail stores, and consumers mostly, but people at businesses as well, could buy a retail upgrade package, and in their existing PC, probably running Windows 3.0 or 3.1 or even MS-DOS, they could pump in the floppy disks or the CD-ROM and install Windows 95. Right. Okay. Now, we'd already decided to have this thing called the Plus Pack, and the idea was to put a set of features in there that would enhance Windows 95 for people who had faster processors, maybe more memory, maybe fancier displays. And so that was a third ship vehicle that was available. And so Brad Silverberg asked me, well, so can you be sure that Internet Explorer be ready in time to be in the retail upgrade box and for the OEMs? And the challenge was that we're going to have millions of copies of these packages, so we had to make the artwork for the boxes and start printing them so we could assemble all these things. And so out of an abundance of caution, I said, let's put it in the Plus Pack because I think I can be undone in time. And but if I'm not, then we don't delay the retail upgrade release. And so as the development schedules worked out, so we were not the long tent in the pole. So we actually got done in time with quality, and so it could have actually been in the retail upgrade. Mm-hmm. But we'd already made the packaging decision, and the Plus Pack was now hey, with internet access and all this stuff. So that sort of ship had sailed, mm-hmm. but it did make the release for the OEMs. So every computer that came pre-installed with Windows 95 had Internet Explorer.
Let me cycle back for a second. So when you decide to do the browser, because of time constraints, that you need to license. You can't do it from scratch. Is that?
Yeah, I think we wanted to get something done as quickly as possible, and so we explored. There was a company called Booklink Technologies. We talked to them. We wanted to license. We wanted to buy their company and get their code. And AOL swept them up. Yeah, so there was some goofy thing where we were waiting for the MSN guys to do the deal, and they weren't. So I don't know. So anyway, so it actually turned out, I think, well, that we licensed the Spyglass Mosaic code because that was, at the time, that was the web browser that had the most usage share. So from a compatibility point of view, it was a great place for us to start.
But obviously, you guys are aware that Netscape is getting started at this point. Was there any consideration of...
Well, not obviously.
Okay.
So what we know today is Netscape started in April of 1994. I started the Internet Explorer effort in early October of 94, and then Netscape suddenly appears right at the end of October. Here it is Halloween today. I think it might have been a roughly Halloween in 1994, And so we hadn't had a clue about them. And so all of a sudden they post their beta, and we are behind.
So then at that point, you've got to pull the trigger. And so then going with the existing Mosaic gold standard makes the most sense to you guys, is what you're saying.
Well, it was the path of least resistance. I don't know what I delegated to Thomas Reardon, who was one of the program managers on my team, to go find us the source code to start with, so we didn't have to start from scratch. And he may have looked at other things, but that ended up being the thing we chose. Yeah.
So, do you launch downloadable beta of Internet Explorer at any point?
Yeah. So I think our first beta was April of 1995. It seems to me.
And that 1.0, would it be fair to describe it as good as you can get to at least get something out into the market?
Yeah, our goal. Well, we did maybe a little bit better than that.
Okay.
So the code complete golden date for Windows 95 was I think it was July 14th of 1995, and then we have a fancy product launch, with a big tent, and I think Jay Leno came and that was August 24th, so kind of 6 weeks later. And so we got so our goal was to get a capable browser done that was included that would match up against Netscape where it could. So there were some things that Netscape was ahead of us because this was our 1.0 release, and they'd already done had a beta, I think, of their 2.0 release, and so they had a few features that we did not have. But there were a couple things we did with progressive rendering and Windows integration that Netscape didn't have. But in terms of user adoption, not very many people were using IE1.
Right. And again, I'm going to back up on one detail. In terms of going with the browser as the main, what would become the main client for Microsoft on the web, was there conflict with say the Word team? Because there's a lot of different features inside Microsoft that are integrating internet features at this point, and so Word would be a logical candidate to be creating things like web pages and things like this.
That's a great question. So, yeah, it's easy when we look back. There's massive survivor bias, right? So you see all the things that actually happened and not the attempts that failed. So the Word group actually built this really fascinating thing called Word Internet Assistant, and it was a plug-in to Word. And so the Word group, if you have a word processor, you look at a web page and you look at a Word document and go, a web page is kind of a crummy Word document. So they built this Word Internet Assistant, which had this HTTP protocol and HTML parser, and so they could read a web page, turn it from HTML into the internal Word format, and then have Word display that. So they actually built that, and it sort of worked. Mm-hmm. The difficulty was it was very slow, and HTML has a different quality in terms of its structure than a Word document, and so there were some things, even with that early HTML format, that Word literally couldn't render correctly. So that was one attempt. There was another attempt. There was an email client group, which I think is what became Outlook, but it's possible it was some other group. And they thought that the web was somehow a subset of email, so they wanted to build the web browser. So there was this kind of sort of territorial, sort of political struggle for this. And my point of view was that and we haven't talked about my memo I wrote in May of 1995. We should probably talk about that. But my point of view is that the web is a platform for application development, and that we needed the world's best web browser that did an awesome job of downloading and managing and displaying web pages, and that it had to be very special purpose built just for that. And so I had a pretty strong opinion about that. I'm kind of a stubborn guy. And my managers, John Ludwig, who worked for Brad Silverberg, who worked for Paul Moritz, who worked for Bill Gates, At least up through Paul Maritz, all thought that was a good idea too. So I ended up getting the sort of support within the organization to go charge ahead on that.
So is there also thoughts that, the standards, even though HTML and the standards that existed at the time were still kind of primitive, still feeling like this is what's going to win out, so we need to have a horse in this race as well?
Well, by 1994, Microsoft's a larger place, and smart technical people, none of us were born with crystal balls, and so smart technical people can legitimately disagree about what they think the future looks like. And so there were a lot of different technology threads that were going on. And so my view, I'd been having all these thoughts starting in the fall of 1994, and I started writing them down. And by May of 1995, I decided to publish a memo, and that wasn't my job. My job was to build software. And Nathan Myhrvold, who you may know, his job was to write a memo once a month. I mean, that was his job, to write these really thoughtful, far-looking memos. But anyway, so for whatever reason, I decided I had this very clear idea about the web as a platform that would challenge and eventually surpass Windows. And so I wrote my ideas down because I wanted to convey that to other people at Microsoft. And so there were some people that thought the future was writing Windows applications, and so when I wrote in May of 1995, and we haven't shipped Windows 95 yet, which is going to be our first 32-bit Windows. Right now, everybody's got 64-bit processors on their iPhones and iPads and Android devices, but we were going from the 16-bit world to the 32-bit world back then. So you could imagine that Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer weren't very happy for me to say that the future was the web and not writing Windows applications. So, in fact, around this time, maybe in the next 6 months there, sometime in 1995, Bill was like, "Don't you see how crummy, the web is? And this reminds us of the mainframe, right? Do you remember how shitty the mainframe was?" And I said, "Well, yes, I use those mainframe terminals too, but PCs are a lot more capable terminals, and the application architecture where you have all the smarts and the data on the server and you can keep everything up to date. I thought that was a more powerful application platform as opposed to writing VB applications or writing Windows apps. We had to distribute these things and keep the protocols in sync and all that. So there was no uniformity of thought about this, and there were a lot of people, including Bill, who thought that Windows was the future and was going to be all these Windows machines, and the idea that the web would be a platform he was not so enthusiastic about.
Okay, that comes up so often that a lot of people at the time, one of the reasons maybe some people were slow to realize that the web was the next big thing was because to a lot of people it looked like technology that was not quite ready for prime time. When you've got the low bandwidth, it's not like HTML at this point is a really sophisticated technology. So I feel like it's come up so many times that people at the time thought, well, yeah, this is the revolution that's going to happen, but it's not going to happen with this rinky-dink web and this HTML and HTTP and things like that. Do you feel like that was true at the time?
Well, again, a lot of people had different opinions about that. So my personal view was, I'd done my first programming with punch cards in 2 or 3 day turnaround time in 1976. I worked at IBM in 1985 and seen that kind of technology. And then here I was in 1995, so another 10 years after coming to Microsoft, and PCs had already gotten faster and cheaper and more capable. And so my view was that the technology trends were such that bandwidth speeds would improve, memory and CPU speeds would continue to improve, displays would continue to improve, and that the applications that people are going to care about, because I'd gone and sort of thought about homes, and back then only about a third of homes in the United States had a computer, and so my view of the trajectory was that these content and entertainment kinds of applications were going to be very popular for almost everyone, and that the technology would improve to support that. And so one thing that you might ask, well, why did the internet sort of take off in 1995, right? So in 1994, if you looked at newspaper articles or magazine articles or TV shows, you wouldn't see a web address anywhere. And by 1996, you start seeing web addresses in advertisements in on the TV everywhere. And so my view of what happened is that you had prices for electronics dropping, whether that's modems or computers, the amount of RAM, the size of hard drives, the size of displays, and the prices came down enough that the market of people who could afford to buy these things increased, right? And back then, still in 1995, you've got modem pools, you've got AOL and CompuServe and other online services that aren't the internet, and they have these modem pools spread around the country, and people have like these 4,800 baud or 9,600 baud modems that they want to get online and do stuff with. And you see that AOL is growing and CompuServe is growing, so you see this growing need that people want to be online and want to be connected. And so for me, seeing all those things together, I predicted, turns out I guess I was right, that the internet was going to be powerful and was going to be big, and that these things would coalesce, would get better, would get more refined.
Well, and the upgrade cycle that Windows 95 sort of kickstarted, in terms of, you didn't see ads like, dude, you're getting a Dell, in the early 90s. Like, the idea, so many people, so many homes probably got their first computers with Windows 95 at this point too.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so it's if you look at in more recent memory, we've seen the adoption first of cell phones, right? And then the switch to what we now call smartphones. Mm-hmm. And so I got my first cell phone in 1994. It was, I think, a Nokia, one of those folding things. And mostly because I had young children and my wife and I wanted to keep in touch with each other. I got my first smartphone in 2001. It was a BlackBerry. And actually, it wasn't a phone. It was a smart device which would synchronize your calendar, your email, and your contacts. They had their own private wireless network. It was very highly optimized, though slow. But you couldn't make phone calls with it, right?
It was just an email device.
It was email, calendar, and contacts, and that was a really powerful thing. And there were less than 1 million BlackBerries in installed base at that time. Mm-hmm. And so, obviously, in the subsequent time, we've had the rise of iPhone, the rise of Android. BlackBerry just went right. They couldn't keep up with the shifting technologies. Nokia did the same thing, right? And so that sort of shift to mobile parallels in some ways these platform transitions from with PCs arising, and then with the web and the internet arising for PCs.
Right. So 95 is just this perfect storm of online sort of coming of age, the computers getting truly mainstreamed, and then suddenly people having this yearning to try out online and things like that.
I think that's right. Yeah.
So getting back to Internet Explorer itself, so you get 1.0 out the door. It goes in with the Plus pack. Do you immediately start developing? I think I even read that you start developing 2.0 and 3.0 simultaneously.
Correct. Yeah. So I had written this memo. The web is the next platform, and if you Google on the web, you can find a copy of this because the Department of Justice discovered that. Right.
I'll put a link to it in the show notes. Yeah.
So in there, I had written the set of features I thought that we should have in Internet Explorer that would ship in by June of 1996, and so my idea was, so we had to compete with Netscape on the one hand, but we also had these more aggressive set of features we wanted to achieve, and so I literally took my 4 most senior engineers from the IE1 team, and as soon as we shipped the IE1 in July of 95, I gave them 4 months to do IE2. And so they did catch-up kind of features. So they had HTML tables was super important because that was this kind of thing where you could really control layout. A few other Netscape enhancements. We added some goodies ourselves. HTTP cookies was another Netscape feature we needed to add so that people could revisit a site and the site would remember them. And then SSL, secure sockets layer, and that was the HTTPS thing where you can have a secure web session,
which allows for commerce and all sorts of
a
other
lot
things.
of things.
Yes.
Exactly, yeah. So and in fact, the SSL, I had an intern from MIT do that code, and there was the crypto code we actually had from someplace else, and then we did a few kind of catch-up things. So the other thing that happened in the summer of 1995 is that Sun launched Java, which was this. That it started as this green, I think, programming language for cell phones or something, but they decided to repurpose it for the web. And so they had these demo pages that had all these sort of dorky Java apps, if I can say that. and so I said, well, we could add some really simple features that would make pages that looked as dorky as those Java apps, right? Mm-hmm. Not that you could write some big complicated thing. So we added this marquee tag, that was my idea, where you could have a little scrolling text. And someone just wrote up the little Windows code to do that. And we had background sounds, so you could go to a page and play a sound. And you could have inline movies, inline AVIs. And the ability, the Windows already had multimedia features to play music files and to play video files. And then we did this thing called VRML, Virtual Reality Markup Language. And the idea was... it was this evolving standard of where you would describe this 3D space in a sort of textual file, and like HTML, and then there'd be a viewer, and so then you could wander through this kind of 3D space. And so we did that sort of speculatively because we could. I had one engineer who worked on that, and it was sort of a cool demo thing. So that was IE2. So we did that in 4 months and shipped that November 17th of 1995.
Wow. So is part of this that now you're focused on achieving parity and then surpassing what Netscape is doing?
Yeah, so we had two threads. So one was like catch up with the important things. So the really key things were HTML tables, because it gave you this nice layout control that people wanted. Cookies, so that sites could remember who you were. And then SSL, so you could do secure transactions easily. So that was that. But then IE3 was the bulk of the team, and that was our leapfrog effort to get ahead.
And so some of the things that 3.0 brings in are, well,
it's a long list of things. I don't want to bore you. So there were a few catch-up things. So we had to implement Java as a parity thing, and there were people inside Microsoft who thought that was a horrible idea. Bill Gates, not the least among them. So if you Google sort of Java, Bill Gates, Ben Slivka, you'll find some nice savory sound bites. So we had to implement Java. We had to do HTML frames, and that's a feature which today I think you don't see very much use of. But it was a thing that people thought was interesting at the time. And then Netscape introduced a client-side scripting language, which they called JavaScript, which really didn't have anything to do with Java at all. They just liked to sort of attach the name to that, and so those were important catch-up things that we needed to do. So the interesting dynamic that's going on right now is, so Sun announces Java, and Netscape is trying to do everything internet. And so they've grown a lot. I think they've IPO'd by this time. They've got a lot of money. So they're scurrying after every possible thing: content management and publishing and application servers. They're doing lots of stuff. And my little team doesn't have to worry about that at all. I have one little goal in life, is to build the world's best web browser. So the Netscape guys decide that Netscape Navigator 3 will be written in Java, right? And it's almost this kind of religious strategic choice that Netscape decides, you know what, we're gonna partner with our buddies at Sun who built this Java language, and we've drunk the Java Kool-Aid. You're gonna write it once and it's gonna run everywhere. So we're gonna go build Netscape 3 web browser in Java. So I think the code name was Navigator, if that makes sense. And I was really focused on time to market and efficiency, and Java was very slow. It was a very slow thing. So, and in fact, Netscape Navigator was an MFC application. So MFC was the Microsoft Foundation classes. It was a set of runtime libraries for C++ whose idea was to make it easy to write Windows applications. And so there'd be all this standard stuff that the class libraries would do, and so your Windows app would be easier to write and faster to write as a result. One small problem is that the MSC libraries took a megabyte of runtime. Now today, when you have gigabyte or 2 gigabytes of RAM, you don't think about that, right? But when you have a 4 megabyte 386 machine, or a 4 megabyte 486 machine, a megabyte of runtime is a lot of space. So we did not use MFC at all. We were a very to the metal C application, maybe some C++. So my focus was building a world-class web browser. Now, we're part of the Windows team, and the responsibility for Windows is to provide services for application authors. And so, on the one hand, you want to make it easy for end users to use Windows and to find files and to print and set up new devices, all those things. But you also want to make it easy for application authors to write Windows applications. And so, as the internet is blossoming, we start to get lots of requests from application authors. So application authors want an HTML rendering engine that they can put in their application. They want a JavaScript engine or a VB script engine that they can use to allow their application to be scriptable. They want an HTTP stack, so they don't have to worry about that, right? So there were a set of features that were in the web browser that these application authors wanted. So we had already had the idea to break Internet Explorer up into a set of components, and this is a thing that gets talked about in the antitrust case. And but our motivation was, we're part of Windows. These are features that people want. So if you think about TurboTax, for example, they have to render tax forms, and they said, if you would do a few things for us and give us an HTML rendering engine, put that into Windows, we could use that to render tax forms, and we wouldn't have to write all that code, right? So we started that work of breaking it up into components, breaking Internet Explorer up into components, and so that was an important part of the effort. Now that comes into play because there's another memo. I don't know if you've seen this memo, how to get to 30% market share in 12 months. I don't know if you've seen some reference to that. So IE1 and IE2 have 1 or 2% usage share if you look at web logs on common websites back in 95 and even into early 96. So we decide that we need to partner with some other folks, and one obvious partner would be AOL. And so they're the leading online service at the time. And AOL wants to be relevant in the internet era, and people are all talking about AOL is going to be roadkill on the internet, right? I think Mark Andreessen might even have been quoted as saying that. So we go talk to AOL, and that's a kind of a funny conversation, right? Because Microsoft had launched this MSN online service, which is basically, if I could say this gently, sort of a crummy clone of AOL. And that had been launched in August of 1995, along with Windows 95. And MSN is not really getting too many customers. And so we tell Bill, we want to license Internet Explorer to AOL, help them. And he basically does the math and goes, yeah, I guess that makes sense. And so because we had componentized Internet Explorer 3, AOL was able to integrate those web browsing technologies into their existing Windows client. So I had 1.5 developers assigned to make sure that worked really well. And in fact, when AOL shipped its client with integrated Internet Explorer, you couldn't tell, right? There was no Internet Explorer branding or Microsoft branding anywhere. In fact, reviewers weren't even sure really what was going on. But that was an important way to increase our usage base, because if you look at Windows phones today, I mean, they have almost zero market share, so no one wants to write applications for them, and no one tests to see whether it works, right?
Right.
So,
it's the classic, if you can get the market big enough, then developers will write for your platform.
Right. Or make sure it works, right? So in our
exactly.
case, we just want to make sure websites worked on Internet Explorer.
So that AOL deal, would you say that was a major component of Internet Explorer eventually?
It was important,
Yeah.
right? You can't. It's hard in retrospect. It's hard to know. Could you take one thing away? What would have changed? So let me remind you that the IE3 features that were catch up with Netscape were Java, writing Java applets, HTML frames, and JavaScript. Those are the three that were catch up things. There were a few things we did that they didn't do. The componentization was important.
Mm-hmm.
AOL naturally might have partnered with Netscape just as against Microsoft, but the Netscape web browser was a monolithic application, so Netscape had no ability to do the integration the way we had. Okay, so we had all the componentization. We added VB script just for the heck of it because we could. Turns out no one cared about that.
CSS.
Yeah, so I'm going to get to that. So
Yeah.
probably the most important thing was cascading style sheets, CSS. So that was an emerging World Wide Web Consortium standard. So we had been active in the World Wide Web Consortium. So this was Tim Berners-Lee coordinating a bunch of folks interested in standardizing and moving the standards and the document formats and the features of the World Wide Web forward. And that's HTTP and HTML and a bunch of other stuff. So this cascading style sheet standard was a proposed standard, and this was the ability to separate sort of content and appearance, and it gave you a lot of flexibility. When we had talked to our own content people at Microsoft who were building things like the Streets and Trips, or the movie Cinemania, or the Encarta app, all these things that are dead now. The internet killed them all. Right. Or we talked to outside folks who wanted to build, interesting content. They wanted those kind of features. So IE3 was also on a tight engineering deadline. And so Thomas Reardon came to me and said, I think we should really try to do this. And I said, okay, you can, take an engineer or two and write the code, but if-def it into the code base, which is to say, if it was running behind and it wasn't going to be complete or too buggy or something, we could, with one compile switch conceptually, turn it off and ship without it. They ended up getting that done in time, and so we were actually the first web browser to ship with CSS support. We also did a couple other things. There was a thing called PIX, the Platform for Internet Content Selection. This was another W3C standard. The idea was that websites would label their content, especially sort of adult content or other things, with these very fussy things. Turns out no one ever cared about that, but we implemented it anyway just because you can't tell. We did some accessibility stuff so that people with limited with vision impairment or hearing impairment, we did some things for them. We implemented the object tag for better or for worse with ActiveX controls and code downloading and code signing. We had an internet adaptation kit, so corporations or universities could make a customized version of IE that had their branding on it. There were a bunch of people who wanted that, and we did some sign up stuff. So those are the high level features out of IE3.
And those are the things that you're saying is the step ahead of Netscape at this point.
Correct. Exactly. Yeah. And I would say there was the cool bar. I didn't talk about that, but there was some of the general user interface that we had on IE, the cascading style sheets, and the componentization. Those were kind of the big things.
So would you say that it is IE3 that starts to reach parity and surpass Netscape in terms of...
we won all the reviews. So if you look at all the reviews, and again, most of these magazines and papers don't exist anymore, but if you looked at InfoWorld and PC Mag and PC Week and all these other things, so we won all the reviews against Navigator, partly because we shipped IE3 and Netscape, when they saw so let me back up a moment. So we shipped IE3 in August of 1996. We had this internet. We had Microsoft every year-ish would have a professional Developers Conference. And the idea was to have developers come in and learn about our latest and greatest stuff. So we had our internet PDC in early March of 1996. So that was the first time we demoed IE3. We demoed our own Microsoft Java VM. We had cloned Sun's Java VM, and our Java VM was faster, more compatible, more scalable, and more reliable than Sun's. We actually announced the AOL deal, and we actually announced a Sun licensing deal at that PDC. And so I think at that point, my understanding, you could correct me if I'm wrong, is that Netscape dumped the Navigator thing and went back to their old C++ code base and tried to catch up, but they didn't have enough time. And so IE3 won all the reviews except PC Mag, who admitted we had the best Windows 95 browser, but because we didn't have one on Linux or Mac or something like that, they still gave the nod to Netscape. But one of the bigger sort of technology threads and market threads that are occurring here is again this question of platform and application architectures. And back when we were working with IBM in the late 80s, they had this thing called system application architecture, which was their idea about how their customers could write an application once and run it on anything from a tiny little PC up to some massively scaled mainframe. I don't think that worked very well. Later you had Java. That was this kind of write once, run anywhere thing. I think what we've seen is that Java on the client never really was very interesting to many people, but Java as a server programming language has proven to be popular and somewhat lasting. So Microsoft is, in the OS2 era, and then in the Windows era, and then upcoming forward to today, it has always been trying to think about what's the programming environment and platform. And so what programming language or languages do you use? How do different client and server computers talk to one another? How do you display information? What's your display format? And do you have one of these or multiple, right? And so you can see, more in the last 10 years, Microsoft tried this Silverlight thing, which was a clone of Flash, basically, right? And the Flash player was another sort of Java-like attempt in a way to have a cross-platform runtime where you could write an application once and run it on many different kinds of client machines. So there were always there was this sort of continual upwelling of ideas at Microsoft about what this client runtime platform should look like and how it should be composed. So there was a project called Forms Cubed, and the idea, and this is back in the mid 90s at Microsoft, and the idea was to be a next generation version of Visual Basic. So Visual Basic was, for those in your audience maybe too young to know, had a form construction package where you could drag and drop different controls in, wire them up, and then have code on them, and then it would talk to some back-end service somehow. And so this Forms Cube was supposed to be this sort of modern version of that. And then Adam Bosworth was leading that effort. And when Adam saw the web, he saw there was another emerging standard from the World Wide Web Consortium, which we sort of think of as dynamic HTML, or the document object model. And here the idea was that you had an HTML page sitting in a web browser, and every character, every piece of text, every line, every image, every box, every visual element on the screen was an object, and you could have scripting code that would interact with that object. And so you could change the text of a piece of text, you could change the size of a box, you could change the image that was displayed in a particular location, you could even rearrange all the HTML and move that all around. And so Adam saw his Forms Cube technology and realized that he could sort of restructure that and turn it into an implementation of dynamic HTML. And so he did that. So I stepped down from IE3. I was asked to take on leadership of the Microsoft Java virtual machine team in August of 1996, just after we shipped IE3. And then Adam became the leader of the IE4 effort, whose primary focus was on implementing dynamic HTML, and that would give a much richer client-side programming experience. And as we see today, if you can't go to any website practically that doesn't have some amount of client-side JavaScript, and some of them have immense amounts. So I don't know, the Facebook, it might have 1 million lines of JavaScript on the client. I might be exaggerating, but it has a lot of JavaScript. And so that's all the dynamic interactive behaviors that you see are coming from that. And so that's, in a way, that's 17-year-old technology, right? Which is kind of interesting. So anyway, so that was IE4. So I took on the Java IE team, the Java Virtual Machine team, and so I led that for the duration of IE4.
And it's IE4 somewhere. There's a magical time in the life of IE4 when Internet Explorer surpasses Netscape in terms of user numbers and things like that.
I'm not sure that I kept track in detail
I don't
when,
think anyone,
when those numbers.
Right.
I'm sure someone has. We could look those up on the web, but yeah, I mean, if you look at
somewhere in 97, 98 time period.
Yeah. And so if you look at the capabilities that Internet Explorer 4 had, it really was quite far ahead of Netscape and other browsers.
Right.
So Netscape started to get distracted by other things.
Exactly.
Yeah. So anyway, so I did the Java VM. In my last couple of years at Microsoft, I worked on the user interface prototype. Some of the less clever ideas, I think, ended up as the Office 2007 user interface, if I could say that gently.
With the ribbon?
The ribbon, yes, exactly. Okay. I still use Office 2003. And then I had a brief stint in MSN, and then it was time for me to leave Microsoft. So in 99, I went to Amazon, and I spent about 9 months at Amazon, which was a fascinating experience, an exciting time. Obviously, Amazon was 4.5 years old when I started. And then my kids were young, and I'd been pretty successful, and so it was time for me to take a step back and do other things besides, running large engineering teams.
And for instance, going to Northwestern games and things like that.
Absolutely.
Right? Just a couple brief questions about the Amazon. I know it was brief. What was your job there?
So I came in working for the Chief Information Officer, Rick Dalzell, and I spent the first couple of months walking around, talking to a lot of people, learning a lot about the company, and then I had. In January, I got what you might call a real job, so I had all the back-end software systems. So it was all supply chain systems, distribution center software, customer service software, and then all the packaged finance, HR, legal systems. Yeah.
But so that's exactly the point when Amazon is changing from books only to everything.
No, they were already on books, music, video, BMV as they called it, and they were getting ready to add a whole bunch of new stuff.
Right.
Yeah, and so that was it was an exciting time at Amazon. Lots of things were going on.
Yeah. To wrap up our conversation with Internet Explorer, I mean, I do want to point out that one of the reasons Internet Explorer overtook Netscape Navigator was because at some point it is the best browser in the world. There's a sense, when I spoke to Chris Wilson and I spoke to Hadi Partovi, and they both sort of said, from their perspectives, what happened to Internet Explorer after Netscape after the battle's won, is that maybe Microsoft took resources away. Maybe they felt like the battle had been won, so there wasn't as much focus on Internet Explorer. Do you feel, I know that you had left the company at this point, but when you look at what happened to Internet Explorer subsequently, and maybe the standard, the quality of the product went down, was it that sort of thing, maybe taking their eye off the ball, losing the focus on that?
I think it's I think that's too simplistic a conclusion. So if you look at my own experience, I'm a nerd. I mean, I was doing assembly language programming in college. I had it was my hobby. I mean, I spent 20 hours a week my junior and senior year of college programming computers. And the Internet Explorer team, I grew from 0 to 67 people. In one 4.5 month period, late 95, early 96, I hired 35 people in 4.5 months. And I was pretty picky about who I hired. There's a book called Competing on Internet Time, which two authors, one at Harvard Business School and one at Sloan School at MIT, wrote about Netscape and its battles on the internet. And they actually sent me a copy of the manuscript to review, and I gave them detailed feedback. And what they summarized to me, and one of the authors, Michael Cusimano, had written a book called Microsoft Secrets, and so he had spent in the early 90s, he spent a tremendous amount of time understanding how Microsoft built software back then. And so they summarized, I said, so why did Microsoft beat Netscape in the browser wars? And they said, well, the Microsoft engineers were more skilled. The Microsoft engineering processes were more disciplined, and Microsoft was more focused on building a great web browser. And as I alluded to earlier, Netscape was involved in so many different things that I think they took their eye off the ball. So we got ahead, right? Mm-hmm. And we had this sort of storehouse of talent and technologies, where Adam Bosworth had this great idea and then was able to repurpose that and implement dynamic HTML very rapidly. So then we got ahead, but we still had the fundamental conflict at Microsoft. And one of the key reasons I left in '99 was I thought the internet was the future and Microsoft should really go do the internet. And here's one example I sort of alluded to earlier. So I tried to search to build a search engine for the web, and explored that idea in the summer of 1994. In early 1995, there was a company there was actually a research project at Carnegie Mellon University called Lycos. And so I called up Fuzzy, who was the professor there who was doing this, and I ended up licensing the Lycos crawl database for Microsoft. I paid $100K a year up front, or $100K up front, and $100K a year for 5 years. That was my license deal. And then I gave it to the MSN guys, right, who ran servers and things like that. And I said, I want you to build a search engine, right, because I thought search was going to be important. My mother was a research librarian for 40-some years, and in fact, she was dialing up search services with 110 baud acoustic coupler modems in 1970, right? So I had some kind of sort of past exposure to this, and so I made the mistake, unfortunately, of asking the MSN guys to build a search engine. I was kind of busy working 80 to 100 hours a week, so I worked on Internet Explorer for 22 months. 17 of those months I was working between 80 and 100 hours a week. So I basically didn't have any spare bandwidth to go build a search engine, but boy did I want to.
There's a fascinating alternative history there if that had gotten out the ground.
Yeah, I don't know if I would have come out with PageRank. That was a clever idea too. Yeah. So, and Microsoft had a chance to buy Google in 98 or 99 for a pretty small amount of money, and chose not to. So I left Microsoft in 99 because I thought that the internet was a threat to Windows and was a threat to Office, but that was the future, and Microsoft should go embrace that and do that. Other people thought differently, and you can see what happened, right? And so, and that's a classic thing that large companies who have been very successful, that's a classic trap they fall into. So, and so I think when you look at what happened to Internet Explorer, it just wasn't strategic anymore to Microsoft, and the internet still felt like a threat to Windows and Office. And so, unlike if you're Google, right, you care about having great web browsers out there to come surf your site so that you can serve up ads, right? Because that's where you make your money. Microsoft doesn't make any extra money from from having a great web browser. And the Microsoft online properties, whether that's MSN or Bing or any of those other things, they're not key to the company, right? I mean, that's not, if Amazon's website goes down, oh my God, right? Heart attack, and Jeff Bezos is calling people,
it's
right?
It's like a strategic product versus a core product, right?
Yeah, I'm not even sure Bing was strategic. I mean, maybe it was, I don't know, but anyway, so I think that was the challenge. I mean, you might ask, why did Microsoft never come out with a great mobile operating system, right? So people could say, oh, the right person wasn't in charge or something, but at the end of the day, it's about the economics. So, imagine if you put someone focused like me in charge of building a mobile operating system at Microsoft. It's too late now, by the way. I mean, Apple with iOS, Google with Android, they've got the market share. It seems very hard for anyone else to come out with any compelling offering. But if I'd been trying to build a great mobile operating system at Microsoft, what would the Windows client team have thought? Right? They'd be pretty unhappy because I'm not going to charge very much money for my mobile OS because the cellular phone manufacturers and the phone carriers aren't going to support $200 a license fee, right? And so if I'd built a really great mobile operating system at Microsoft, then people like Dell and Compaq and others might have gone, let's see, we could pay $200 for Windows, or we could pay $10 for Ben's OS. Maybe we'll do that, right? So that kind of dynamic, which is about market share and money and things, made it very hard for Microsoft to do anything in the mobile operating system space. It made it hard for them to really be successful online, right? So I think it's those dynamics that are the best explanation for why Internet Explorer maybe petered out, if you want to say it that way. So.
Well, I always end with a similar question to everybody. I could ask you this in a million different ways. What do you think of where software has gone? But I'll harken back to the memo in '95 that the web is the next big platform. So it's almost 20 years on from that memo now. The technology, not just the web, everything now. Is it more than you thought it would be in '95? Is it not quite where you thought it would be in '95? What do you think 20 years on where we are now?
Well, I went back and read my 1995 memo just to sort of refresh myself about what my 20-year-old idiot self was thinking. And so I got a lot of stuff right in there, I guess. And I think for the most part, I'd say we, in terms of laptop, desktop computers and web architectures and websites, I think we've done a lot of the things I thought we were going to do. The thing I didn't understand or really predict is the rise of mobile and mobile devices. There was a 1991 cover story in Scientific American about tablet devices, and here I have my iPad Air and my iPhone 5S. Sorry, no Microsoft devices. And so this article about ubiquitous computing 23 years ago. He got it right about that we'd have all these tablets and things and we'd be moving around between them. So that was interesting. The future, if you think about it, is, so now we've got where people were writing Windows applications and Macintosh applications for PCs. Now people are writing iOS apps and Android apps. And I've gone back and forth between a Nexus 5 and an iPhone 5S several times for weeks at a time over the last year, and I'd say Android is now caught up with, and in some cases ahead of iOS, and so Apple is in a tough situation because they've got this premium product, and but it's Android. Apple only has, I think, about 12% sales volume of smartphones today worldwide, probably higher in the United States. So if you look in the next 5 years, it looks like Apple has a hard time trying to keep up with that because the hardware manufacturers will keep innovating, the prices will come down, and it'll be hard for them to have that premium. They're trying as hard as they can, Apple is, to add services. So they've got the iTunes Store, they've got this new Apple Pay thing, they've got this thing where you're supposed to be able to move between different devices and it follows you around. So they're trying as hard as they can to create this ecosystem of services that's really, all-inclusive and keep you there. So that'll be interesting to see what happens to that. HTML5 is sort of a new thing. Again, the promise is there of write once, run anywhere, right? That you could build, sort of rich interactive applications with HTML5 and not have to customize it to different operating systems. We'll see. That has never worked yet, but there's always a first time for that. And of course, the future, if you look at software, you have all this machine learning and big data stuff that's happening. That'll have dramatic effects on medicine with things like Dr. Cloud. We saw a news story yesterday about Google, and they want to be able to report, blood levels automatically with little nanobots. Self-driving cars, 3D printing. There's a whole bunch of stuff coming down the pike, all of which requires software. And there's, of course, the Internet of Things. People are working on that stuff now. And lots of people have made predictions about those things, so I won't bother.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ben Slivka, though, thank you for remembering all that stuff for us, and thank you for bringing your notes so that we could get it all the details right.
Very good. You're welcome. Thank you, Brian, for having me.
If you're enjoying this podcast, there's one simple thing that you can do to help us out. If you do nothing else, just go to iTunes and rate us. 1 to 5 stars takes about 2 seconds. Or give us a review, because the weird way that iTunes works is it's not just the number of downloads, it's also the number of ratings and reviews. As always, you can join the conversation at www.internethistorypodcast.com, get more info, see pictures, and see my full bibliography for each episode. The show's Twitter is @NetHistoryPod, and my personal Twitter is @BrianMCC. Thanks for listening.